Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. So, Peter, we don't spend enough time, I think, talking about Finland, the Baltics,
But
the
we spend more time on it than anyone else.
exactly. And there've been some interesting developments in recent weeks, Baltic Sea and in Finland. So it might be, occasion to provide a summary of recent developments. In the case of both Finland and the Baltics, in particular, the most belligerent of the Baltic states, which is Estonia.
The
Um,
Estonian tiger, you mean?
the Estonian tiger,
Which,
the the
which is actually a cover for a chihuahua.
that's right. Because the Estonia, which gave us Kaja Kallas, one of the most distinguished statesmen
A gift.
of
A gift.
recent times,
Gift.
yes, and she is the top foreign policy person of the EU, so she runs EU foreign policy.
Believe it or not, yes.
Believe it or not. So Estonia gave us that, and Estonia recently has been getting into quite a nasty spat with Russia over what he calls illicit oil shipments. And as we've discussed before, of course, there's nothing illicit about them. But Estonia said, no, we got to deal with this, And so they threatened to start boarding
Doing their bit.
exactly boarding ships that they claim were beating sanctions, as if the EU sanctions
Shadow.
have any
Shadow.
bearing on anything. Exactly.
The shadow fleet.
The shadow fleet, that's it. And now, in the meantime, Finland, which joined the EU in
NATO.
2023. Sorry, Finland joined NATO, exactly. They were already members of the EU. Finland joined NATO along with Sweden in 2023 after a referendum. Oh, whoops! After there was no referendum. Yes, after a lengthy debate. No, there was no lengthy debate. It was rushed through in 2022, and the only reason it didn't get through in about 2 months is that Hungary and Turkey kind of raised
No,
some
no, 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 no.
exactly. There is a few objections, but in the end, you know, they went along with it, and so it took 2023 before they were finally inducted into NATO. But now what's happened?
So what was Stoltenberg? Russia wanted less NATO, but got more NATO.
That's right, exactly. And then, of
George
course,
is better with the imitations.
exactly, Mr. Putin wanted less NATO. Now he's got more NATO.
What
Now,
a knee slapper that one
what a knee
was.
slapper!
Who would have thought that guy had that level of comedic,
Comedic.
dexterity to him?
Exactly. The strange thing was that Stoltenberg didn't quite realize that in making this quip, he was undermining his own position, because they say, yeah, so that's what this whole war has been about. NATO expansion, just as Russia has insisted from the start. That's the problem, and you've admitted it, that was the issue, and now you make things worse by having more NATO. You're guaranteeing the next round of fighting. But anyway, Finland seems to have woken up to kind of an alarming situation. It has an 800-mile border with Russia.
Should have thought about that.
They hadn't really thought about that, and Russia seems to be strengthening its forces on the border. They're moving their forces
Who would
to
have
the
thought?
border with Finland.
Who would have thought?
Who would have? Yeah, who'd have thunk? And so the Finns are getting a little nervous, and they're a little upset, and they're going to
But were they nervous and upset when they were outside of NATO? I don't think so.
yeah, and so the media are interpreting these stories as if Russia is threatening NATO, whereas in fact Russia is defending itself. What are you supposed to do when you've got an 800-mile border with NATO? Leave aside, all of the borders with, with the Baltic states. So here's a couple of recent media stories giving voice to Finland's very reasonable alarms. It's saying here, Finland, quote, preparing for the worst as Russia expands military presence near border. They're preparing for the worst. Head of strategy of Finnish defense
Russia is developing its military presence within its own border.
within its own borders.
Oh, okay. Well,
And
all right.
there's the more it never the logic, as NATO talks more and more about the coming war with Russia, particularly the UK keeps talking about it, Germany talks about it, Macron talks about it, all this, there's talking about it in the Netherlands. Well, the more you talk about it, the more you're going to make it a reality. I mean, of course, Russia is going to move its forces to its border with NATO. I mean, if that NATO is preparing for this war, what do you expect Russia to
Well,
do?
I mean, it's kind of like, so the Europeans are preparing for a war against Russia. I guess Russia has to start preparing for war against NATO. See, where's the chicken and the egg here?
Well,
Okay.
that's right. And here's a problem. You can keep saying you're a defensive military alliance, but when you keep talking about this war that you're preparing for, it doesn't sound defensive. Indeed, expanding NATO right up to Russia's borders has never really seemed very defensive. But apparently, Russia is not supposed to do anything because NATO insists that it's defensive. Well, we're defensive. So if Russia makes any preparations, well, then obviously it's Russia who's
Well,
being
if it's
aggressive.
defensive, why does it have to expand?
Exactly. It's a new kind of defense. Again, this is the bizarro logic of NATO. So he says here, the head of strategy of Finnish defense forces says they are monitoring Moscow's maneuvering very closely. And here's this Finland
Yeah, but I
has
mean, George, you
yeah.
go back. So the head of strategy of the Finnish Defense Forces. Well, what did you expect to happen joining NATO? Well, what did you expect?
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's very true. But Finland is also losing financially because Russians aren't going to visiting Finland anymore. So Russians used to go to Finland and buy stuff there. That's it's now an economic blow to them that Russians aren't coming across the border to make their purchases. So that's
Oh,
another
and you know what,
problem.
George? It was one of those kind of oddities of the Cold War. Everybody, it's common to talk about sanctioning Russia, but keep in mind, everyone, the Soviet Union was sanctioned for its entire existence.
Right,
Russia knows how to deal with
right,
sanctions because the Soviet Union was sanctioned,
right.
with a few small exceptions.
Yeah,
Finland was the exception.
right.
Finnish Soviet trade was quite robust.
Yeah,
It basically focused on raw materials like lumber,
right,
where Russia's got no shortage of trees. I can tell you that.
right,
Okay,
right,
export the lumber to Finland. Oh, Finnish furniture. Yeah, I heard about that. Really good wooden furniture, and that was all Russian lumber.
right,
Okay,
right,
and they selling their finished products for about 500% more than the cost of the lumber.
right,
That's a pretty good margin,
right,
everyone. That lasted all the way up until they joined NATO.
right. That's right. And then, but of course, there are these Russian visitors who would be
Oh,
coming back.
and the Europe's foreign policy chief, Kalakalas, her husband was involved in that trade.
That's right. That's right. So now that they've closed the border, they're not getting any Russians coming across the border and buying stuff. So that's a source of revenue that's now gone for Finland. So Finland is now has it's suffering economically from joining NATO, and now it's suffering militarily because, hey, we're in the front line. We didn't really think this would happen. Because ultimately, when you're in the front line, you've got a real problem on your hand. You can get whacked over the head hard without any real guarantee that anyone's going to come to your assistance. Because, yeah, you got Article 5 and everything else, but you don't know whether anyone's coming to your assistance. So you can just keep getting whacked over the head and no one's going
Well,
to do
well,
anything about
and
it.
George, what if they do come to your assistance?
Yeah,
What's that?
exactly.
What's that worth?
That's right. That's right. Um,
Yeah, okay, I don't want to go into a graphic example, but I mean it's a day late and a buck short, literally.
that's right.
Okay,
That's right.
you're the first one whacked.
Yep.
I mean, there's nothing to come to rescue.
No, that's right. And that's right. And everyone had already known this during the Cold War, and which is what caused a lot of anxiety during the Cold War, is saying, well, okay, I mean, if there is, say, a Soviet attack, okay, the Soviets got to occupy, large chunk of Germany. No one's going to do anything for a long time because they're going to start having to discuss, well, what do we do now? How do we arrange this and so on? Don't immediately think, oh, they've crossed the border. The nuclear weapons can now fly. I mean, that's not how it's going to work. And that's why I think people always say, yeah, what happens then? So we've got Soviet occupation. That could go on for a long time. So that's why if you're on the front line, you really have no guarantee that you enjoy any kind of security.
Yeah, I mean, and there'll be countries like Portugal, like, well, I mean, what do you want us to do about it?
That's right. Um, so it says if Finland has said it expects Russia to further build up troops along their shared border when the war in Ukraine ends, after reports that Moscow had strengthened its military bases near the NATO frontier.
Which wasn't the NATO frontier not long
That's
ago.
right. Major General Sami Nurmi, the head of strategy of the Finnish Defense Forces, said the military is following Moscow's maneuvering very closely and that it was their job as part of a NATO alliance to prepare for the worst. Well, that's good. Responding to Russia's changing activities, Donald Trump told reporters on Thursday he was not worried about it at all, adding that Finland and Norway were going to be very safe. So that you see, when he says something like that, that doesn't reassure the Finns. I mean, obviously, because he's the American president, and as American president, your job is to stay out of wars. So he's basically saying, yeah, you're going to be okay. Anyway, I've got my own problems now to deal with, but
Well,
you'll be fine.
maybe just try to work it out, okay? Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, because ultimately that's the point. I mean, if you're an American president, everyone is trying to drag you into a war, and so you can say, yeah, we'll get right on it. Just as soon as we've sorted out, we've got 10 other issues that we have to deal with here. Echoing the president's sentiment, Nomi said there was no immediate military threat towards Finland or NATO from this direction. He added, what happened right after the Ukrainian attack was we applied for NATO membership, and then when we were accepted, Russia announced they would start to change their military posture across the border.
As he said, so I um uh, there's no irony there, is
No,
there?
there's no.
It's just there's no irony.
No, there's no. And then this is from the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. And they have said, satellite images show that Russia is increasing its military presence on the Finnish and Estonian borders. Airfields are being repaired, tents and warehouses are being erected, and vehicles are being moved to the area. Since April 2023, Finland's eastern border has also been NATO's external border. When Finland joined the defense alliance, Russian President Vladimir Putin threatened that this would result in problems. Has the Kremlin now begun to make good on its threat? Well, there's no threat here. They're just saying, the situation now changes, and, we're obviously going to take appropriate measures because we now have NATO and 800 miles of NATO on our borders.
Funny how for decades that wasn't an issue, was
No,
it?
no, And then, according to Western intelligence services, Russia is preparing for a large-scale war against NATO. To develop the capabilities potentially needed for this, the Kremlin has reorganized its armed forces. As part of the reform, the Leningrad military district was reactivated in 2024. According to Finland's military intelligence service, as many as 50,000 new Russian soldiers are to be stationed on the Finnish border. The current total is around 30,000. And then Estonia's Ministry of Defense regards Russia's military reforms as part of a broader effort to build up its military in preparation of a prolonged confrontation with NATO. The threat, it says, is growing. In response to previously submitted questions, the ministry spokesperson writes, the probability of a direct attack remains low, but the increased military presence and enhanced military capacities in the vicinity of Estonia increase the risk of misjudgment and escalation. Estonia can talk about misjudgment and escalation. I mean, they're the classic case of misjudgment and escalation. And then Mail Online. Why is Putin massing troops on the border of Finland? Military buildup similar to the prelude to Ukraine war sparks alarm in NATO.
So irresponsible. God.
But it's so funny because the Mail normally writes about some British general has just said that, well, I think we'll probably be at war with Russia in about 3 years' time. This is regular. No one thinks that there's anything alarmist about that. No one thinks, oh, hey, the Russians maybe get a little nervous if you say that you're expecting a war within 3 years. But now apparently we're supposed to get alarmed. He's massing troops on the border of Finland. And then it says satellite images have revealed how Moscow is bulking up its military presence on the Finnish border in a chilling echo of pictures taken of Russian bases before Putin launched his war in Ukraine.
Yeah, but see, the I don't know the genius that wrote this, but comparing Finland to Ukraine in this context is just meaningless. Is because Russia for 30 years said NATO, Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO.
Right,
Finland is a member of NATO.
right.
So making the comparison is ridiculous. There's no, this is apples and oranges. No, Finland became part of an
Right.
aggressive military alliance directed against Russia, and Russia's not supposed to do anything about it?
That's the point. I mean, if I think any responsible Russian leadership, anyone, Putin, whoever, is going to take seriously Finland as a frontline state, and is going to be looking exactly as to what are NATO's plans in Finland. I mean, what you're just supposed to say, well, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to put anyone on the borders, because well, NATO's a defensive alliance. I mean, they said it. They told us that it's defensive. So, well, we're not going to put our forces on the border. Well, of course, they're going to do that because it's a question of capability and intent. You know, Europe, they're threatening with militarization, and their intent, they keep talking about a war with Russia. Well, what's Russia supposed to do if they keep talking about this war with us? Well, we got to get ready for it.
And what is their involvement in Ukraine? Are they there for Ukraine to win? No, they're there for to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. It's not for Ukraine. I
Right.
mean, all of this is patently clear in Moscow.
Exactly. Exactly. So it says Moscow is building troop accommodation, aircraft deployment infrastructure, and refurbishing all facilities at key military bases in a sign that it is seeking to reinforce its capabilities in the border region. And then Kremlin officials hit back on Finland and Sweden's recent accession to NATO, and then Sweden's chief of defense says, when we applied for NATO membership, Russia said it would take such steps. We are now seeing that happen. Huh.
Huh.
Boy, I mean, boy, no wonder he got this big job.
That guy was clairvoyant. Yeah.
Exactly. And
Only
then,
he could see that
oh,
happening. Wow.
exactly, yes. And then it says here, and then we go on to the next, the Wall Street Journal. The Russian military moves that have Europe on edge.
Edge. There we go.
We're on edge. Putin is expanding bases and preparing to move more troops to European border regions far from Ukraine. We're expecting some conflict with NATO. And then, with President Trump and many other world leaders preoccupied with the war in Ukraine, some Europeans are growing alarmed about what the Russian army has been doing much more quietly along other stretches of its border with Europe. Some 100 miles east of its border with Finland, the Russian city of Petrozadovsk, military engineers are expanding army bases where the Kremlin plans to create a new army headquarters to oversee tens of thousands of troops over the next several years. And then these soldiers, many now serving on the front lines in Ukraine, are intended to be the backbone of a Russian military preparing to face off with NATO. Um,
This
and
is
th-
a editor. Is this is an editorial?
no, it's a news story.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's
I
always
mean,
hard
preparing
to
to face
differentiate.
off. I mean, that's an editorial license.
Exactly. And says Finland, which was forced to surrender territory to the Soviet Union in 1940, has spent decades trying to avoid confrontation with Moscow, has spent decades trying to avoid confrontation with Moscow.
That's why I didn't join NATO.
Yeah, that was part of the deal. I mean, look, Finland was, took part in the invasion of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was an ally of Hitler's. Now, at the end of World War II, Stalin could have said, you know what? I want Finland back within, it used to be part of the Russian Empire. I think we need to rectify that. And we're going to incorporate it within the Soviet Union. He didn't do that. He didn't even insist on having a communist regime in Helsinki. Um, the only thing was the insistence that Finland maintain neutrality. That's why, it's often been said Finland got a very good deal. It had a border with the Soviet Union. It had taken part in the invasion of the Soviet Union, and so basically it could have absolutely got clobbered, but it didn't. It did a lot better than everyone else who took part in the invasion of the Soviet Union. So here they thought, oh, they spent decades trying to avoid confrontation. No, they spent decades enjoying the very lenient treatment they got at the end of World War II. Um, and now, having joined NATO after the Ukraine invasion, it is fortifying its border with electronic defenses and barbed wire fencing. Um, Trump, who has been pressuring Ukraine to accept a ceasefire while trying to rebuild U.S. ties with the Kremlin, has said worries that Russia has any ambitions beyond Ukraine are overblown. Asked in February about Ukrainian President Zelensky warning that Russia could wage war on NATO if the U.S. reduces support for the alliance, Trump said, I don't agree with that, not even a little bit, which of course is the rational position, which no one in Europe has. I don't believe Russia has any intention of invading any country in Europe, and that's a rational position, and that therefore this hysteria in Europe, which the militarization hysteria, is so misplaced and is obviously not really having good consequences, just as in these descriptions about what Russia is doing on his border with Finland.
These people who write this actually probably just don't know any history. There's no self-reflection here. Like,
Right,
you know, for every action, there's an equal reaction. Well,
right,
this is the equal reaction.
right. Exactly. Um, and then military experts inside Russia, though, characterize the activity along the Finnish border as part of the Kremlin's preparation for potential conflict with NATO. When the troops are back from Ukraine, they will be looking over the border at a country they consider an adversary, said Ruslan Pukhov, director of the Center for the Analysis of Strategies and Technologies, a Moscow-based defense think tank. The logic of the last decade shows we're expecting some conflict with NATO. Um, Keep in mind, Macron has spoken, and others have spoken about bringing NATO troops to Ukraine. Russia has said no, but then we don't know what they're planning, what the plan of Macron, Starmer, and Merz is. So there's every reason to be quite concerned about what their intent is. If, as any kind of Russian military political leadership will be thinking as to what does NATO intend.
Well, I mean, George, even though Ukraine isn't a member officially of Ukraine, Russia watched for 8 years how it was NATOized.
NATO
Okay.
is, yep.
Okay. So when a country that had no foreign policy problems with Russia, like Finland, joins an aggressive military
Correct.
alliance, you should expect that they see a potential conflict with NATO.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
It doesn't mean it's going to happen.
No,
Okay. But I mean, if NATO is preparing for a conflict with Russia, then Russia has to prepare for a conflict with NATO.
you would think that's a fairly obvious point. Russian officials have sent mixed signals. The defense ministry late last year, Russian defense minister Andrei Belousov said Russia's military must be ready for a conflict with NATO. At the same gathering, President Putin said the West was alarming its own population by suggesting that Russia was ready to attack and that current tensions were NATO's doing. Yeah. And then, we have a Danish intelligence, a February report. Danish intelligence warned that Russia could launch a large-scale war in Europe within 5 years if it perceived NATO to be weak. And then a ceasefire in Ukraine would allow Russia's military to be ready even faster. Western military officials warned.
Oh,
So
so there you go.
that's
There
right.
you go. There, the
That's
cat is out of the bag.
that's right.
Okay.
That's right. Um, and then it goes on, about Moscow military district, and then here's the New York Times says Russia beefs up bases near Finland's border. Tents, shelters for fighter jets, and warehouses for military vehicles show Russia's presence near one of NATO's newest members.
But these same forces are within the borders of Russia, right?
That's
So NATO believes it has a prerogative to determine what Russia's military can do
that's it.
within its own borders.
That's it. That's right. Right. Russian forces have been beefing up bases and building military infrastructure near the Finnish border, according to recent satellite imagery, in moves that could reveal their strategy for what happens after the Ukraine war. The Finn chick was now making a ton of money working for the Tony Blair Institute, living in London or whatever. I wonder if she takes any responsibility for any of this. Probably not. I mean, she just did what she was expected to do, and then was handsomely rewarded. But she was the one who kind of pushed for this, and even as she was dancing and cavorting around at wonderful parties, but she brushed Finland through. No debate, no referendum, just boom. Hey, we're now in NATO, and then look at the consequence. The imagery confirmed by NATO officials shows row after row of new tents, new warehouses that can store military vehicles, renovations to fighter jet shelters, and steady construction activity on a helicopter base that has been mostly unused and overgrown.
And this is exactly what the Kremlin wants them to see.
Right. That's right.
This is the consequence.
That's right. So far, the moves seem to be the early stages of a larger, longer-term expansion. And NATO officials say this is nothing like the build-up along the Ukraine border before Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. But Finland is one of NATO's newest members, joining 2 years ago, and the moves no doubt reflect Moscow's own perception of a threat. This 830-mile frontier is now the Western Alliance's longest line of contact with Russia. Military analysts predict it could become a hotspot, especially with much of it lying in the increasingly contested Arctic Circle. And then Finnish defense officials
The
predict.
Arctic Circle is not, it's not, no, that's completely exaggerated, okay? There's very clear lines of delineation in the Arctic Circle. Come on.
Right,
It's just,
right.
it's just absurd.
But in the sense that any attack on Russia, a military attack, would indeed come around through the Arctic Circle. I mean, it would be through the Sea of Murmansk, the White Sea, all of that stuff. Um, so that is absolutely a vital security concern, because it absolutely would be part of any future conflict.
Hey, why don't we demilitarize the Arctic? See, I
Right,
mean,
right. Yeah, that's right. Um, but as things stand, that is a crucial strategic location. All of that part of the Arctic, the White Sea, the Bergen Straits. That's why Finland was always a vital piece of real estate. It's a small, doesn't have too many people living in Finland, but it is a crucial piece of real estate. Um, and the Finns think they have 5 years or so before Russia can build up its forces to threatening levels, but they are confident it will happen, and then the number of Russian troops facing them will triple. And then from Moscow's perspective, the Russians need to bolster their defenses to protect themselves from NATO expansion, which has always been a sore subject. Interesting, the New York Times kind of admits this. From Moscow's perspective, the Russians need to bolster their defenses to protect themselves from NATO expansion, which has always been a sore subject. The Baltic nations were the first members of the former Soviet Union to join NATO, bringing large stretches of Russia's border up against NATO's. The prospect of Ukraine, an even bigger former Soviet republic, following suit was so threatening to Moscow that it became one of the causes of the most devastating land war in generations. This is the New York Times. This is
yeah. Well,
this
and George and I are not going to argue.
yeah, exactly. I mean, this was quite. That doesn't have the usual thing. Well, Putin wanted to dominate Ukraine because he's afraid of democracy and the whatnot. This is the New York Times here, pretty much admitting that that's the cause of this war. Whenever the Ukraine war ends, one senior NATO official said Russia would redeploy troops further and further to the north. Russia believes that the Arctic and access in the Arctic is a key to great power status. The official said, speaking on condition of anonymity, according to satellite imagery, Russian helicopters returned to a base near Murmansk, a port city in the Arctic Circle, after they had not been there for 2 decades. And then dozens of Russian warplanes were recently spotted at the Alenia air base, also in the Arctic, and fewer than 100 miles from the Finnish border. And then, so other recent activity includes more than 100 new tents that appeared about a year ago at Kamenka, Russian base, fewer than 40 miles from Finland. So you can see here that the Finns are getting, concerned without really thinking through why they got themselves into this strange situation, because there was no need for it. I mean, after all, they were only nominally neutral. I mean, in theory,
Yes.
they were neutral. They were not formally part of the North Atlantic Military Alliance, but they were cooperating at all times. They were
Well,
cooperating.
this has been reported. Okay, like for example, Soviet submarines,
Right,
departing from their
right,
bases. Of course, they would be watching that and following it, and they would tell NATO. Okay, and the Russians knew it.
right,
Okay, I mean, there was always a tacit cooperation going on, obviously, but the Finns knew the lines too. Okay,
right, right. That's right.
because they knew they had a good deal.
It was a very good deal. Um, and that was it. I mean, during the Cold War, it was a pejorative term, Finlandization.
Finlandization.
The last thing anyone wants is Finlandization. But it wasn't that bad. with Finland had in domestic affairs, it had entirely autonomy. You know, the Soviet Union never interfered in domestic Finnish politics. All they wanted was that you don't join up with NATO, that you don't do anything to cooperate with NATO against us. And so it essentially its foreign policy was we're going to maintain neutrality. I think that was a very good deal, given given its geography, given its history. It got a very good deal. And so the question then is, why did Finland throw this away? And it's striking, and you know we've said this before, that they didn't have a referendum and they didn't have a debate, public debate. They rushed this through.
Well,
Stoltenberg and the rest of them rushed this through.
why did it happen? Okay. It's a theme that George and I have touched on many, many times. Elite capture. They captured that elite, okay? And so it was a natural inclination for these people
Right.
because, being on a Fulbright to Yale and then this military school, in Washington and all, it's just a circulation, cultivating these elites here until you completely capture them, and then their top priorities are quote unquote Western values, Western institutions.
Right.
Okay, that's how you get it. I mean,
Right.
it's very expensive, it's time consuming, but you get pay dirt. You
That's
really
right.
do.
That's right. That's
And that's
exactly
why you never have elections about it, because you're not cultivating the electorate, you're cultivating the elites.
that's right. Exactly. And that's why essentially, you know, you're canceling democracy. You know, you're basically canceling any kind of political accountability because it's just the same elite, the same people are in charge. You know, this is left of center, this is right of center. It doesn't matter. You know, these elections are just meaningless. You know, the Finn chick was in power, then she's out of power, but the Finn chick, you know, she's got a nice gig at the Tony Blair Institute. You know, she'll probably be back at some point in Finnish
Well,
politics. So
maybe she'll run Estonia. It doesn't matter. Okay.
exactly. So speaking of Estonia, Estonia has been getting itself into some interesting confrontations with Russia because Estonia, which is I think the loudest of the Baltic Chihuahuas, seems to have taken it on its head that hey, we want to provoke a direct war between NATO and Russia. I think it's a really good idea because we're obviously going to come out of it, you know, very well. And so they had passed legislation enabling them to board ships in international waters that they suspect are carrying illicit Russian oil or ships that are violating laws about insurance or whatever, or ships that they suspect are engaged in sabotaging undersea infrastructure. So they passed this law in April, and we talked about this back in April. Here, this is the legislation. Estonian president approves law enabling military to attack civilian ships. This is from TASS. According to the media, the approved amendments give the Estonian Defense Forces permission to use force in the country's maritime zone to address threats against critical infrastructure, defense facilities, ports, and other installation.
Just look at the title of that.
Yeah,
Just reflect upon that. Estonian president approves law enabling military,
that's right. Military.
military to attack civilian
Yep.
ships.
Yeah. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then this is the Estonian president, Ala Karis. He approved these amendments to the law on the organization of defense forces, which stipulate that the military can attack any civilian vessels they see as a threat to the country's crucial facilities. And then, according to the media outlet, the approved amendments give the Estonian Defense Forces permission to use force. And then earlier, the country's parliament passed a law. Russian presidential aide Nikolai Patrushev, who chairs the Maritime Board, slammed the Estonian law as disgusting and highlighted the need to axe the initiative. So that never happened. And then Zaharova said that Estonia's adoption of legal amendments allowing the country's navy to use force against foreign vessels was a provocative action that poses risks to shipping and security in the Baltic Sea. Baltic Sea, which of course NATO claims is a NATO lake, it's ours. You know, we own it. Um, and so anyway, what happened then in April, as we might have expected, is that Estonia seized a ship, one of these shadow fleet tanker ships, and it says the Estonian Navy detained an oil tanker belonging to Russia's so-called shadow fleet in the Gulf of Finland. And then the vessel called Kivala was detained off the Estonian coast. Um, and the move marks Estonia's first detention of a shadow fleet vessel. And then Estonian authorities said the tanker lacks a flag state, meaning it is not authorized to sail in international waters. And we are acting in coordinated and targeted manner to protect our security and environment, and we are implementing our right to check suspected ships passing through Estonia's exclusive economic zone. So this is just made up. They don't have any of this, the right to go around, boarding ships anytime they feel like it. Anyways, it says that they said this always the checking the ship's document and legal status. Um, and then here it says Estonia, um, and then so they after they did this and they got away with it, of course, naturally they're going to do it again. And they did, in fact, Estonia did it again, but this time the Russians responded and refused to cooperate with the Estonians. So it says Estonia says Russia sent a military jet after bid to detain illegal oil tanker. That's illegal, as if it's. Estonia's foreign minister said on Thursday Russia sent a military jet as his country's navy tried to detain a Russia-bound oil tanker under sanction by Britain, accusing it of sailing illegally without a flag. After the vessel, the Jaguar, placed on Britain's sanctions list last Friday, refused to cooperate with an attempt to board it. The Estonian Navy said it was escorted to Russian waters. The Russian Federation sent a fighter to check the situation, and this fighter jet violated NATO territory for close to 1 minute.
Uh-oh.
Violated. So we can go around seizing ships in international waters, but it violated NATO territory for close to 1 minute. The Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tashkna told reporters. And then we need to understand that Russia has officially tried and connected itself to the Russian shadow fleet. He said, speaking ahead of a meeting with NATO foreign ministers, the Russian Federation is ready to protect the shadow fleet. The situation is really serious. So this is serious
Well,
now.
who's made it serious?
Exactly. They said, speaking ahead of the
Who's
NATO.
the one seizing ships?
Exactly. Exactly. Military jets from a NATO policing mission based in the Baltic states took off to inspect the Russian vessel, said the minister, who earlier called on X for Russia to face tougher, faster sanctions. And then the ship was near this Naisa island off Tallinn when the Estonian Navy communicated with it by radio. And then, as it was sailing without a nationality, Estonia had an obligation to verify the vessel's documents and legal status. The vessel denied cooperation and continued its journey toward Russia. Given the vessel's lack of nationality, the use of force, including the boarding of the vessel, was deemed unnecessary. I think I mean
Well, I
necessary.
mean, I'm sorry, maybe this is really naive, but did they ask, are you flying a flag?
It's very exactly. No, they just decided to board the ship. Um, and then an Estonian patrol escorted the Jaguar until it reached Russian waters. And then here's the re.
Oh,
Uh,
are they still funded?
they're still funded, yes. But I think this is just Biden money. This is still money that had been appropriated under the Biden administration. So it says here Estonia accuses Russia of serious threat to NATO after fighter jet disrupts tanker inspection. Estonia has accused Russia of creating a serious threat to NATO in the Baltic Sea after a Russian fighter jet disrupted operations by the Estonian Navy to inspect an unflagged tanker that is on the United Kingdom sanctions list. I mean, I was a United Kingdom sanctions list. Oh, well, we,
Well,
we, we don't want to mess with the United Kingdom. I mean, it's on their
oh,
sanctions
you don't
list.
want to mess with their sanction list,
Oh,
okay?
wow. We don't want to. I don't want to be on that. I wouldn't want to be on the sanctions list. The ship, the Jaguar, is believed to be part of Russia's shadow fleet that Moscow is using to avoid international sanctions imposed over its war in Ukraine.
Well, no, that's a gross
Yep.
mischaracterization.
Yep.
Is that the international organizations that administer insurance for cargo shipping,
Yep.
Russia has been blocked from that. So Russia has its own.
Right.
It's a direct
Right.
insurance program with the Russian state. There's
That's right.
nothing illegal
No.
about it. It's more cumbersome. It's more
That's
expensive. It's
right.
a pain in the neck. Yes,
Right.
but it's not illegal.
That's right. That's right.
You deny someone these you kick them out of these international institutions, and then say you're breaking the law. Well, I mean, you're the one that did this. You're the predicate.
That's exactly right. That's exactly. But also when they say international sanctions, well, it doesn't matter what the EU sanctions are because they have no validity under any international law. Those are not United Nations Security Council sanctions. They're just sanctions unilaterally imposed by the EU. They have no validity when it comes to Russia. Russia's not a member of the EU. So it doesn't, Russia's under no obligation to follow EU sanctions. So to say, oh, they're trying to avoid international sanctions, no, they don't care about these sanctions. It has no legal effect whatsoever on Russia. Estonia's navy said the vessel refused to cooperate when asked to stop. Oh, well, yeah,
Well, when Estonia says stop your ship, you should listen,
that's
right?
exactly. This country of population of 1.2 million. You better stop. Um, and here's the tweet that was sent out by this Estonian foreign minister. And it says, on May the 13th, a Russian fighter jet violated NATO airspace to protect a Shadow Fleet tanker. This incident is yet another example showing that Russia poses a serious threat not only through its war in Ukraine, but also to the NATO alliance as a whole. So you provoke this confrontation. Basically, they sent a fighter jet. You basically had to back down because, you having provoked this confrontation. And then you send out this tweet saying Russia poses a threat to NATO. Well, maybe it wasn't such a great idea to start seizing ships in international waters. And then here's what happened then was that the Russians decided to seize an Estonian oil tanker. It says the Russian Federation on May the 18th detained an oil tanker sailing from the Estonian port of Sillamäe. The Estonian foreign ministry reported the incident comes 3 days after Russia reportedly violated NATO airspace with a fighter when Estonia attempted to intercept a suspected Shadow Fleet vessel in the Baltic Sea. So you had basically the incursion by of NATO airspace, and then you have this. They seize this Estonian oil tanker. The oil tanker Green Admire was a Greek-owned vessel sailing under a Liberian flag. The Estonian foreign ministry said they departed from Estonia following a previously agreed upon route via Russian territorial waters. Oh, so they still they still have these agreements. Well, we're just so they seize um, these shadow fleet, and then in the meantime they're still having these agreements with Russia. Oh, it'll pass through Russian territorial waters. Hope you don't mind. Oh yeah, sure, that's fine. Yeah. And so, well, Russia stopped. This is Trade Winds, the global shipping news source. Russia stops Greek tanker leaving Estonia in tit-for-tat Baltic move. Incident comes 5 days after Estonian Navy and Air Force tried to haul in a tanker ballasting towards Russia.
Oh, I've never heard that. Ballasting towards. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It's a nice phrase. Yes,
That's a nice phrase.
yes, yes. Um, a Greek-managed tanker carrying Estonian fuel oil was intercepted by Russia in the Baltic on Sunday, and then it says that it's supposed to happen when this was sailing in the Russian waters along a previously agreed route. If confirmed, this incident likely represents Russian reprisals
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
for repeated interceptions of Russian trading vessels.
That's really an insightful observation, don't you
That's
think?
right. That's right. Reprisals for repeated interceptions um, by various littoral Baltic states over the past few months. Russia already flexed its muscles on Tuesday when it sent a fighter jet to discourage Estonian forces from hauling the ship. And it says when the Argent incident for the first time lent weight to previous statements by Russian officials that they were ready to take forceful measures against what they perceive as attempts by its neighbors and geopolitical rivals to obstruct its trade and weaken its hand in the Ukraine war. You don't really want to obstruct trade. I mean, that's just not a good move because they're basically warlike acts. I mean, if you're basically engaged in your normal trading commercial activity and then you start seizing ships while you're engaged in normal commercial activity, that's a warlike act. There's no ands, ifs, and buts. That's a warlike act. You interfere with international shipping, that's a warlike act. Always been accepted to be a warlike act.
Yeah, but also, this new in this tiny country in NATO that is probing, constantly probing.
Yes.
Don't be surprised when there's reaction to your probing.
Exactly. And they're probing, hoping to provoke this confrontation. Quite how they think this is going to work to
Yeah,
Estonia's advantage.
what's the day after tomorrow
Yes.
scenario?
So, I somehow wonder, the people who live there, I mean, are they just off their rocker or they just don't have any, there's just no democratic accountability there, or it's just like, you think whatever,
Well,
you
my
know,
suspicion is that Estonia, because it has zero weight, it's just saying we're pulling our weight, we're doing something. I think that's it, George. You know,
that sounds
this is one for the team.
That's right.
Okay.
Exactly. Look, we matter. We're significant. The media are writing about us. We get stories about us in the New York
Yeah.
Times.
Yeah, clip that one. Clip that article. Put it in the.
Exactly. No one used to pay any attention to us. No one knew anything about us. Now they're writing about us. Um, and then Reuters says Russia releases oil tanker from Baltic Sea detention. And then says Russia releases Greek-owned oil tanker, and so the detention of the vessel has increased concerns over potential escalation in busy Baltic Sea lanes where major oil supplies pass through, and then after separate action by Estonia in recent days to stop tankers as part of enforcing Western sanctions on Russia. And then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia issued a statement.
They got a good. That's a pretty cool. What is that?
Logo, yeah.
Yeah, logo there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Russia detained the oil tanker Green Admire as it was departing from Estonian port of Sillamäe. And then today, May the 18th, the Russian Federation detained the oil tanker Green Admire sailing under the Liberian flag and owned by a Greek company. So the navigational route selected for its maritime safety and not aligned strictly along national boundaries had been established through mutual agreement between Russia, Estonia, and Finland. To prevent similar incidents in the future, Estonia will redirect traffic to and from Saaremaa exclusively through Estonian territorial waters. Okay. Today's incident shows that Russia continues to behave unpredictably, says Foreign Minister Margus
I don't know. It
Chakta.
seems the unpredictability is the Estonian side, but that's just me.
Exactly. I love this. I have also informed our allies of the event. I'm keeping them apprised of legal of these developments. So, I mean, it's really amazing how these Baltic chihuahuas behave in this reckless way. Again, for the time being, it seems like this crisis has been averted for the time being because these people don't stop. So they're essentially pushing an agenda on NATO, and then you have Kaja Kallas, the former Estonian prime minister. She's somehow shaping EU foreign policy.
Well, but there's growing complaints about her
Oh
in
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
a lot of complaint. But it's something, George, goes back to from the basically from the start of the special military operation. You and I have talked about it. We talked a lot about it before, not so much
right.
today, but we're going to have to. Is that the whole Article 5 thing
Yep.
is it's very interesting because um, there are those that are on the NATO side that want to test it. I
Yes.
mean, how far can we
Right.
go?
Right. Right.
This is not a board game,
Yes.
everyone. This is really serious stuff.
Right.
And considering, NATO, I mean, 2 years ago, you were not allowed in polite conversation, or even in alternative crowds. This is a proxy war. George and I have talked about this as
Yep.
a proxy war from day
Right.
one.
Right.
Well, that's normal parlance now
Right.
in the West. It's a
That's right.
proxy war, all
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And that's when, Article 5 gets into, very problematic
Right. That's
areas because
that's
I mean it's like, you know, it's not a direct, it's an indirect conflict. And is Article 5 applicable to some when Article 1 says NATO shouldn't be doing these things in the first place, provoking a conflict,
right.
okay?
Right.
And so you have the Estonians that have taken upon themselves, oh, let's tinker around with this.
Yep.
Let's see what this means.
Right.
That is insane. That's really insane.
It really is, and I think that's what they're trying to do. I mean, Russia had to step in because if they didn't, I mean, Estonia would just make this a regular thing. They would just be seizing these ships. I mean, they already seized one. There was no reaction. Boom, right away, they're going to seize another one. If there'd be no reaction, they would go and seize another one the next day. I mean, they were just seeking this confrontation, and then, oh, Article 5, there you go. We're under attack from Russia. Now, I think it hasn't worked this time. I think the Trump administration probably made it clear through NATO that we're not
Could you
interested.
imagine if it had been the Biden administration?
Exactly, it would have been a much bigger crisis, and I think that's the difference. That just there's just no there was no response from Washington saying, "Hey, yeah, we've got your back." They said, "Hey, you started this, you provoked this. We're not getting involved," and I think that's why they kind of beat a hasty retreat. But this is the mentality. You remember when Finland it was about a year ago. Remember when they were started this whole drumbeat about how Russia is sending migrants into a country? That they were waging a hybrid war. Russia's waging a hybrid war. We need to close all the ports of entry because Russia is just sending these migrants, and we are keeping NATO abreast of developments. Just because we're under attack from Russia. So that was then this whole nonsensical thing that we're under attack. Again, they were trying to provoke this confrontation, and this is really the problem when you start bringing in all these states into NATO. It actually everything gets more and more dangerous. Uh,
Absolutely. And that's that these alliances. Yeah, I'm glad the Trump administration is saying, maybe you should take care of that yourselves
Right.
here. I mean,
Right.
we're going to contemplate the end of humanity because you provoked a nonsensical,
Right.
provoking Russia into doing, and Russia did. Okay,
Right.
so what's the next step to Estonia? Back off
Right.
or up the ante?
Right.
Okay, and are you speaking for the entire Western world?
That's right.
I mean, how many people, in the Netherlands and Portugal say, "Well, we have to go to a war over a tanker
That's right.
on the
That's right.
coast of Estonia."
I think the UK seems to have been involved in this
Oh, yeah, yeah.
because it was this the number of these stories mention how this ship was under sanctions by the UK. And really like within a day so the UK imposes sanctions on the ship, and then the very next day Estonia seizes it. So it looks like this was coordinated, the British and the Estonians. But clearly
But
Washington is just not going to get involved.
it just really proves that something we've talked about so many times is that the UK standing in the world economically is not significant
No,
anymore. It's
no,
bigger than a lot of other economies, but it's not a player,
no,
okay?
not a player.
Um, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, oh, we need a UK trade,
Right,
US trade agreement. Well, we'll
right,
get in line, get in line. We'll take care of it. It's not top of mind. It's not
no,
very important,
no,
okay?
no.
Militarily, well, you can put the entire military in one stadium, okay?
Yeah,
Militarily,
that's
okay?
right.
Sailing the seas around the world, no, that was a long, long time ago, okay?
You're right.
Well, my point is that the only card they play is intelligence. That's what they do. That's and it's dirty work. It's nasty. It's covert, unaccountable. Okay, and that's the only way they can, be at the table. Well, one of the things I found really interesting is something that I've reflected upon a lot of the last few weeks is that the specter of Yalta 2.0. Well, all the Great War conferences, the UK was there.
Mhm.
It was at the pinnacle. It shouldn't have been, but anyway. But today,
No, I don't think
no
so.
one even thinks about that.
No, no.
Okay. And you know what irks the Brits the most, George, is that Russia's still at the table.
Well, that's the thing.
It still matters.
Right, but
Okay.
that's the thing about the
But the
UK.
UK doesn't. And that really irks them.
Well, that's the thing that what the I mean, this goes back to, in 1953, actually, when following Stalin's death, Churchill advocated hey, let's get the big three back together again. We're going to have another big war conference. Stalin's gone now. We can, and the Americans said, nah, I don't think so. And largely because they didn't really think there was any reason for Britain to be at that table. Yeah, you were there in 1945, but by 1953, Britain really was, and that was 53. That was already 70 years ago. And Churchill's plan to have yet another big conference after Stalin's death came to nothing. But at least, let's say during the subsequent years, when you had Thatcher, Reagan, and Thatcher, that it meant something. Thatcher somehow had aligned herself with Reagan. Reagan kind of liked her. She kind of, she blazed the trail in a way for Reagan. She was before Reagan, because she won in 79, he won in 80. But that era gave Britain a weight in the world. It was punching above its weight. Britain was already not a significant player in 1980s, but it was punching above its weight because Reagan gave it this standing. Same thing happened incidentally with Tony Blair. You know, I'm no fan of Blair to say the least, but somehow his partnership with Bill Clinton during the sort of bombing of Yugoslavia, his partnership with George W. Bush, invasion of Iraq, gave Britain a standing in the world. And Britain was able to punch above its weight. Hasn't worked since then. That was really kind of a last hurrah for Britain, 20 years ago. Since then, it's really been very, very dismal. And now it counts for nothing. I mean, because Trump is so indifferent toward the Europeans. He's just, it's absolutely nothing. I don't even know if he's going to go for this. There's going this meeting, the state visit. I don't know if that's going to go ahead. Because remember when Keir Starmer invited him for the state visit, I haven't heard anything further about whether any date has yet been
Well, he
set.
might want to, do a spot check of his golf courses.
Yeah, I don't know. He didn't even seem that excited by it, to be honest, when Keir Starmer forwarded this handwritten letter
Well,
from the king
the reason why
inviting
I
him for a
mentioned
state
it,
visit.
the reason why I mentioned it, because I'm in agreement with you. I mean, what role did the UK play in this Estonian caper? I bet there's something there. I don't
Oh,
know.
sure,
I don't have any
absolutely.
facts. I don't have, but it's part of a pattern.
Yes, I mean it's very interesting how Britain imposes the sanction on this particular ship, and lo and behold, the very next day, Estonia seizes the ship. I mean, that's how does that work? Just pure coincidence. But you're right. I mean, the thing with the British is they're very good at intelligence, or at least they claim they're good at intelligence. They're able to
Well,
persuade.
they've got their fingerprints all over the place.
We had Russiagate was cooked up among the British, but then even during, like the Skripals, they seem to exert amazing influence over the CIA with all the Skripals nonsense. So they have these links with the intelligence through the Five Eyes and so on. And of course, they're very, very good at propaganda. They've always been good at that. How do we get the Americans involved in a war to pull our chestnuts out of the fire? Right? I mean, really good at that. How they play the American scene. It's not really working at the moment. I mean, Trump just doesn't seem to care very much about them. So Starmer is just not. It's not working very
What
very
did what
well.
did what
Trump's
was the
Washington.
country western song? I mean, not that I listen to much of it. I don't. My mojo is working, just not on you.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, that's right. So, and he wasn't in on that phone call, the recent phone call with for some reason Starmer didn't
It
get
was
on
really
it.
interesting because when on that phone call they listed what countries
Yeah,
were, but they never said, and notably the UK was not.
no,
Nobody, it was just left like omission.
exactly. So
And there was only a few people. You and I picked it instantly up on
that's
that.
right,
Okay.
exactly. Well, what happened? Oh, other, other engagement. No, no, no. There's never any other engagement. For a British Prime Minister, when you're having a telephone conversation with the American president, you don't have any other engagement. Something more important to be getting on with. No, no, no. He wasn't on there. I mean, clearly, there had to have been a
He
reason why he
probably, I
wasn't on
mean,
there.
maybe he was checking that he had no contact with these male models that tried to firebomb his former residence. Okay. Interesting how that story just kind of disappeared.
Yes, that's right. I wonder if Starmer does come to Washington to meet Trump again, Trump might just bring it up and just ask him, what happened about those, all these very nasty explosions? All your properties keep getting destroyed. What have you done about them? Um, that, he was, it's a very, very odd story. We covered it last week, and no real proper explanation has been put forward to this very strange, story. Properties, old properties that of the prime minister being firebombed.
To put a bow on this here, this is a really fundamental theme of our podcast is that while a great deal of the focus is on Istanbul right now, as it should be, we'll see how it pans out if it happens at all. But you have all these little skirmishes non-stop. What happened to these cables in the Baltic
Yeah.
Sea? No explanation.
No.
Oh, this warehouse in Poland blew up. The shadow fleet.
Right.
It goes on
Right.
and on
Right.
and on. Rigging the election in Romania. has everything to do about NATO, everybody.
Right.
At the end of the day,
Right.
that's what it's all about, okay? This is nonstop. It
Right.
never, ever ends,
Right.
okay?
No,
And and
no. It
and they're planning it for at least 5, 10 years to continue it.
right. No, that's it. And I think that's the theme of, the stories that we looked at is essentially not, oh, Russia's threatening here, Russia's threatening there. Is basically NATO is planning the next confrontation. Then they're
Yeah.
planning it in the Baltic with the Baltic states, and they're planning it in Finland. That's it.
And
That's what they
the
plan.
Black Sea is always an active
That's right.
file.
That's right. And so that's why they're already thinking, beyond Ukraine. And of course, there's, oh, Russia's going to do this, Russia's going to do that, but that's not, no, no. It's NATO that's already planning the next stage of the conflict. In the Baltic and, yeah, in the Black Sea. That's the key. That's what NATO is about, and I think that's why it's important to emphasize these stories. Is that, hey, NATO, there's no one in NATO land thinking in terms of any kind of a détente or any rapprochement. No, they're already planning the next
Well, I mean,
round
if
of
Russia
confrontation.
isn't a threat, then why do you need NATO?
Exactly. That,
That's how it works,
that's right.
everyone.
Exactly. That's
You
right.
need
That's right.
threat inflation. Oh my goodness,
That's,
rapprochement,
that's right.
coming to an agreement.
No, 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 no. Exactly. That's exactly.
Perish the thought.
That's right. Not only do we need NATO, we need more NATO. We need to spend lots and lots and lots of more money on NATO because of this Russian threat. And of course, it becomes a self-fulfilling thing because, of course, the more you spend on your military and the more you keep moving your forces eastwards, well, you're going to get a reaction. And then you oh,
There
oh
we
my
go,
God, we're
George.
threatened from Russia.
We have to rename the podcast The Russia Threat by the Gaggle. I mean, could you imagine? We'd get funding
That's right. The
just with the
Russia.
title, The
Sure,
Russia Threat.
sure.
Oh,
That's right. That's right.
George said they're good at propaganda.
Yep.
They are. People
That's
buy
right.
it. All
Exactly.
right, that's our mega wrap here. Um, uh, it is the days are getting much longer now. I'm looking at it. It's at 8:41 p.m. It's still light outside, okay? And we're not even close. It's going to be another month of longer and longer and longer days.
Well, I like long days, I have to say.
But it's very difficult to say, it's light out. I'm not going to have a drink. I'll wait. Okay. In the winter, it's like no, there are no
You
excuses.
see, lunchtime is when you start drinking because it's always black outside. Yeah.
All right, everybody, this is Gaggle with Peter and George. We're on Locals. So go to we're on Locals, so please go to thegaggle.locals.com. Tomorrow we do our live stream at 10 Eastern time. Please join us. We're gonna pray, rosary the bit to make sure it works, and then George goes back on the trail with solo.
Exactly. Tuesday, 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then you got to think about the dogs because the dogs are saying, well, that, hey, where are the gold coins? Buddy in particular, he emphasizes gold coins.
Yeah, he always does this.
Exactly. Silver, what about silver, buddy? No, I don't want silver. I want gold. And I guess with Apple, I mean, I think he goes with crypto, but paper, I think, he wants paper money, paper,
He
not
likes streets too. He's young still. Okay.
exactly. So if you have anything lying around, no matter how big, so please, all of it into the tip jar. No hesitation. We're very grateful for all of your help, friendship, and support. The more you're able to donate, the more of these videos we can make, the more we can improve on the technology, and above all, we have to appease these dogs because these dogs are angry and they need appeasement. So remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye bye.